You should see my video as well. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming along to this morning's SCURL copyright session. My name is Greg Walters and I'm the current chair of the SCURL Copyright and Legal Matters group. Normally I would run through just the housekeeping of the session, but today you'll have me also doing the welcome introductions. So with that established, we'll now go into some housekeeping. To begin with, if you could please keep your microphone muted when the speakers are delivering their presentations, that would be appreciated, thanks. And there will be an opportunity to engage with the speakers after the presentation through a Q&A session. And if you can either please use the chat box to enter your questions, or if you prefer, you can ask them verbally by using your microphone to ask your question. You'll be prompted to unmute your microphone when looking to converse with the speaker. And on a side note, please only use the share screen button if you're a speaker and when prompted to do so. And this session has been recorded and will be made available via SCURL's YouTube channel. And also this goes for both speakers and attendees. If you have any links you'd like to share during the session, please feel free to do so via the chat box. Finally, and one final note, none of the content delivered by the speakers or discussed during the session, that includes the Q&A, should be considered legal advice. So nothing that's discussed here should be considered legal advice, just to further clarify that. And I know most people might be familiar with the functionality of Zoom, but we'll just quickly go over some of the functionality for both attendees and speakers. So if you're an attendee, there's a toolbar at the bottom of the screen. And if you want to unmute yourself when prompted, then click on the microphone button as shown on screen to unmute or mute yourself. If you'd like to ask a question verbally during the speaker's Q&A session, please make use of the raise hand button. Now this is found by actually clicking the reactions button that's found in the bottom toolbar, and the pop-up will appear that has the raise hand button in it. So that's how you can access that piece of functionality. And finally, if you'd like to use the chat box, you can do so by clicking on the chat button, and again that is found in the bottom toolbar if you prefer to engage with either speakers that way or participants as well. So just to go over that with you as well. And now some functionality for the speakers. You can click on the share screen button located on the bottom of the toolbar. This will produce the pop-up that is shown on screen in the middle. And what you do is you would then select the screen you want to share within your device, the window rather. And when you've selected the appropriate window, you then click on the share button. And once your presentation is concluded, you would then click on the stop share button. And I think that's everything. So we'll now go into the welcomes and introductions. So good morning again, and welcome to today's SCURL Copyright and Legal Matters Group Winter Conference for 2022. As you'll see from the programme, we have a wide variety of topics that have been covered by our fantastic speakers. To begin with, we have with us all the way from Japan, Benjamin White, who is a PhD researcher at the Centre for Intellectual Property Policy and Management at Bournemouth University and chair of LIBOR's Copyright and Legal Matters Working Group. And this morning, Benjamin will be discussing the copyright exception for text and data mining. And we're very happy to be joined once again by Dr. Emily Hudson, who I believe is joining us all the way from Australia. Emily is a reader of law at King's College London and will be delivering a presentation around controlled digital lending. We'll then pause events for a 10-minute break. And to follow on from this, we have Bridget Vienza, who is Director of Policy, Open Culture and Glam at Creative Commons, and Bridget will be delivering a presentation about promoting access and reuse of cultural heritage, Creative Commons and agenda for copyright reform. And to conclude this morning's excellent event, we'll have Chris Banks, who is Director of Library Services and Assistant Provost Space at Imperial College London. And Chris will be presenting about rights, retention and the development of institutional open access policies. So we have a great programme, and I think that's me for the moment with the introduction. So I'll pass over to
Benjamin when he's ready. I'll just stop sharing my screen, and I believe that will be us. So I'll just stop right there.
Well, good morning, everyone, and I suppose good evening to Emily. And first of all, I'd just like to say thank you very much to SCURL for inviting me to speak. And I suppose it's worth, I suppose in terms of my background, I've got a long background in advocating for copyright reform to reflect the needs of machine learning. And I guess my kind of relationship with this goes back to 2008 when I was at the British Library. And I think we were the first people to actually call for an exception for what's now called text and data mining to allow machine learning. And quite a lot has happened in the interim at the policy level. So what I'm going to do today is sort of base my talk a little bit in reality to explain why I think intellectual property, and particularly copyright, is important when thinking about regulating AI. And then I'm going to sort of do a compare and contrast primarily with the UK exception that we've had since 2014 and the new exceptions that we see in the Copyright and Digital Single Market Directive that were or should have been transposed into all member state law by May of last year, but that hasn't happened in part because of COVID. So first of all, you know, essentially what's come to be called text and data mining in law is the same as data analytics. It's essentially the process of machine learning software. The press and data scientists like to call that algorithms, which process data to produce some predefined result. And if you look at the world's largest companies in terms of market capitalization, they are dominated by companies whose businesses are now in no small part, and depending on the business, in very large part, dependent on AI, or in the case of NVIDIA and TSMC, you know, creating hardware to allow AI. So AI is called a general purpose technology. A general purpose technology is technology which can be developed and put to many different uses. So an engine is a good example of a general purpose technology. Electricity is another general purpose technology, and you can probably sense from previous, and the wheel is of course a general purpose technology. And as you can tell, general purpose technologies change society and the economy quite radically. So, you know, already we can see that these AI industries, or these industries that deploy a lot of AI in their products and services, are worth huge amounts of money. I mean, the value of these companies is something like 5 times the GDP of the UK, 4 times the GDP of Germany. You know, huge values. And one merchant bank estimates that essentially the intangible assets, of which intellectual property is a major intangible asset alongside things like know-how and training. Intangible assets make up something like 90% of the value of the S&P top 500. So that's sort of code for basically saying intellectual property is a major regulator of modern companies who deploy software and technologies, and therefore IP, I think, is integral to how we should think about regulation of artificial intelligence. So what I'm going to talk about one specific area of regulation, and that is how different legislatures have facilitated machine learning, where machine learning is being undertaken on third-party copyright, or in Europe, sui generis database rights. So, you know, the largest database in the world is the internet. All those companies that I've just mentioned, other than perhaps NVIDIA and TSMC, you know, they will gain huge amounts of value from processing data that's available on the open web. And the European approach to this is what are called enumerated exceptions, so specific exceptions that sort of in detail outline what you can do when performing a certain act without the permission of the rights holder. So sometimes we call this a permitted act or limitation and exception, the term that I've used there. So in Europe, we like to have very sort of specific exceptions, quite detailed. In fair use countries, they may have a specific exception, but they also have what's called an open norm. And I would imagine most people have heard of fair use. So in the States, fair use, in Israel, fair use regulates machine learning, where, as I've said, third-party copyright works are used for processing. And then Japan has introduced an interesting sort of hybrid open enumerated exception, which we don't have the time to go into, but that's why I'm in Tokyo, just sort of doing some research around the history and actually what this new exception means. But I think it's a really interesting, using a Blairite term, a third way in terms of limitations and exceptions, where it combines the open norm with the European enumerated approach that we see in this area. So this is a table, and I'm not going to really talk about Japan and the US here, but I'm going to kind of go through this in the presentation and just sort of explain where we're at in terms of text and data mining, in terms of UK copyright law, and where we're at the European level. And without giving any spoilers away, I think if you kind of quickly analyze this, we're in the great position of the UK amongst all these different countries having now by far and away the worst copyright exception for data mining and for supporting big data and AI. In 2014, it was pretty good. Certainly it was the first one in Europe. Japan actually predated the UK by 5 years. The UK exception was not as good as the Japanese 2009 reform, but we were the first country in Europe to introduce a dedicated exception. And now events have overtaken us. So yes, we now have the worst exception. So sorry for the spoiler, but that's the summary of my presentation. However, there has been a government consultation which closed, I think, on the 7th of January, and I'll talk a little bit later about LACA's response to that. So essentially, given the huge value that AI is creating for industries, one would have hoped that the UK would have introduced an exception that allowed for commercial use. It didn't in 2014. And it introduced an exception which was for the sole purpose of research for non-commercial purposes. And the reason for this was actually because of the limitations in the European Copyright Directive. So the UK essentially plugged this data mining exception under the broad research exception that sits within Information Society Directive, the Copyright Directive. So that's actually why in 2014, because we didn't have the flexibility in UK law, we would have had to have a change at the European level in order to introduce an exception that allows commercial use. So In 2014, that, to be fair, was as good as it gets, or got rather, and obviously now, to quote Boris Johnson, the idea of Brexit is to make is it British or English lion roar? That doesn't seem to have happened very quickly, certainly in copyright circles. So it will be very interesting to see what happens as a result of this Intellectual Property Office consultation that's just closed. However, in Europe, we have seen copyright reform, and what we see is Article 3, which is for the benefit of research organizations and cultural heritage institutions for the purposes of scientific research. So you don't see the word non-commercial there, but if you look in the recitals, it says that essentially a research organization is not an organization upon which commercial undertakings have a decisive influence. So I'm actually not sure what the Commission, when it came up with that proposal, what sort of research organizations undertake commercial activities that do not have any kind of commercial entity controlling its research. So quite why that was needed, or quite what the intention is, I am a bit unclear, but you can see it it does actually, certainly theoretically, allow commercial use by research organizations and cultural heritage institutions, in theory. Then we also have another exception, which is Article 4, which was not present in the initial 2016 proposal from the Commission. So as the proposal was being discussed in Europe, in the European Parliament, and particularly the European Council, it was agreed that, lo and behold, in the era of artificial intelligence and big data, maybe Europe needs some kind of flexibility in the copyright regime to allow businesses to benefit, because businesses in China and America and Japan, et cetera, are benefiting from flexible exceptions which allow AI, but Europe isn't. So, sounds pretty logical to me. So what they did was they created an exception which is for businesses, which allows commercial use. So, but what actually ended up happening, because obviously quite a lot of council members were kind of nervous about supporting big data and AI, and wanted to narrow the exception. So we've ended up with this exception, which sort of gives with one hand, allows commercial use, but then takes with another. So it says, the exceptional limitation provided for shall apply on the condition that the use of works referred to in that paragraph has not been expressly reserved by the rights holder in an appropriate manner, whatever that might mean, such as machine readable means in the case of content made publicly available online. So presumably, if it isn't made publicly available online, but like a license to a university, then one would assume to see that express reservation for commercial uses, remember, in contracts. So I mean, I'm not aware of any other exception where the government says, yes, you can have this exception, but then rights holders can deny you the right to enjoy this exception. We do have hybrid exceptions which say, well, if there isn't a license, you can use the exception, or you can use the exception if there isn't a license. But this doesn't do that. It basically says, here's an exception, but rights holders can decide not to allow you to enjoy this exception, which I'm not aware. I think this is new. and I think it's really interesting getting philosophical about things. Japan introduced a very innovative approach to allow AI, this hybrid open enumerated norm. Europe has done something innovative, but at the other end of the spectrum that's pretty appalling. And I kind of I think a lot of me actually thinks that this is indicative of the fact that processing of data by machines is just not what copyright is there to do. You know, there's a lot of literature when the world essentially decided in the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s that software should be governed by, you know, software machines written in code, which is sort of the world of patents machines, that actually know code is equivalent to writing something expressive like a book or a poem, and therefore we would also, in addition to patents, protect software by copyright. To me, Article 4 is a great example of copyright being stretched far too far. Oops, reproduction. So copying, essentially a core act in copyright law. Sorry, in the UK, you can make reproductions of all types of copyright works, including sui generis database rights. Interestingly, Article 3 in the European directive does not allow text and data mining of software, but it does under Article 4 for commercial purposes. And I think that is an interesting development. I think it's just a mistake. I don't think it was intentional, but there we have it. And, you know, AI processing software to make predictions to write other software is happening here and now, but that is not allowable under Article 3 for mining by research organizations. And in UK and Europe, which is not the case in America, arguably, and not the case, I believe, in Japan, but in Europe, we require that the copyright works that are mined or processed, let's say, have been lawfully accessed. So kind of good example of this is, you know, videos on YouTube. If you want to data mine videos on YouTube, you don't know whether they've been uploaded legally or not in certain instances, or the mining, you know, might be in contravention of terms and conditions, which is less of a problem in Europe, but is a problem in other jurisdictions. So this lawfully accessible requirement is something that you don't see in Japan, and you only see if you're circumventing technical protection measures for research purposes in the States. Sorry, my computer is very slow. So, okay, so you can make copies, your machines can make copies to do the analysis. How do you share the results? So sharing of the results is, there's silence in the European directive as well as in UK copyright law. And how much you can share, you know, it's not mentioned at all. So the question is, how much can you then really share? So and I won't go into this because this is very complex and you can read the slide, but one of the ways that you can potentially share is using the quotation exception in UK law, which was updated in 2014, which essentially says that you can quote a work as long as it doesn't exceed, you know, the purpose for which you're using it. I won't go into that because we will run out of time, but the quotation exception in UK law is an area that may or will definitely allow you to share some outputs from the data mining process. Another way that you can share is if your results are not subject to copyright or sui generis database rights. So if the output from the AI is yes or no, or Tuesday or 95% chance, then there is no copyright in that output. So you can definitely share the output in that sense. There's a whole debate about whether there is copyright in computer generated works, which the UK addresses, but again, no time really to go into that. Use of exceptions, sui generis, database rights have research exceptions. I've mentioned quotation. And then interestingly, in Germany, German law does create a situation where it isn't communication to the public, i.e. you can't share it with everyone, but you can share outputs and derive data within sort of closed research groups that are affiliated to your research, something which the UK law does not allow. Security, there are no security requirements in UK law, but Article 3 requires that appropriate levels of security are maintained around the data that you are processing. And it also allows for rights holders to create some security measures which protect their servers and their sites where they are hosting data. But again, in terms of rights holders, those measures should not go beyond what is necessary to achieve that objective. And this links nicely. Sorry. And then bizarrely, Article 4, which is for commercial purposes, although those commercial purposes can be negated, doesn't impose security requirements at all on businesses, and simply says that the data can be retained as long as is necessary. So we've got these great exceptions, but as with all exceptions, in the modern digital world where so much is governed by licensing and terms and conditions, it's pretty pointless having the exception if the contracts can then override that exception. So the UK protects many education, research and library exceptions from override from contracts and licensing. So in 2014, this was a very welcome development and is now sort of spreading across Europe, and now is actually being discussed in Japan as well. So the good news is if you want to do data mining in the UK under the UK non-commercial research exception, you don't have to worry about the contracts. They have introduced a similar provision now in European law regarding text and data mining 3 by research organizations and cultural heritage institutions. 5 is teaching, that's a difficult subject, and 6 is preservation. So we can see that this non-override of exceptions started a major jurisdiction like the UK, an important jurisdiction like the UK adopted these provisions that protected limitations and exceptions from contracts. And now we can see this in European law as well. So I think this is a great development for libraries and researchers. And then my final point really is technical protection measures. So the UK provision basically creates a situation where if a data miner, someone doing AI for non-commercial research purposes, wants to analyze something, and technical protection measures like capture are preventing that, then government cannot intervene in the UK because the material that you're wanting to circumvent is available online and under terms and conditions. And this provision is reflective of how the Copyright Directive was in 2014. However, what has happened subsequently in the new Copyright Directive, in the DSM Directive, is it basically says that these provisions which stopped governments allowing users, or stop governments intervening to allow users to circumvent technical protection measures, the directive has moved on, is now saying that those provisions are not relevant for text and data mining by research organizations and for archival purposes. i.e., if there are technical protection measures in the European Union, you will have the right, subject to whatever process member state law stipulates, to circumvent those technical protection measures. However, the UK law is preserved in aspic in terms of how the Copyright Directive used to be structured. So, final slide. As I said at the beginning, Intellectual Property Organisation, IPO, has consulted on an update to TDM, and the Libraries, Archives, Copyright Alliance. Some of my colleagues are on the call or on the webinar. Hello. We put in a submission at the beginning of January saying that the text and data mining exceptions should be more flexible generally than they currently are. They should allow commercial use, and they should allow circumvention of technical measures. One of the questions which I found a bit unsettling in the consultation was, should text and data mining, should AI be subject to license? You know, it seems that we had that conversation leading up to the 2014 change amendments to UK law. I don't know, it didn't feel good that the government AI or use of third-party copyright for AI purposes, because that isn't what is happening in fair use countries like Israel and the US, and it isn't what's happening in other parts of the world like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and China. So I'm hoping that was just civil servants exploring all the different options, but it did unsettle me that it was still being asked 8 years after I thought we'd put that issue to bed. So that is the last slide.
Many thanks, Benjamin. That was wonderful. Thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed that. It was great to hear and fascinating to hear all about the TDM exception from a UK perspective, but also where it sits globally, where it used to be and where it is now in terms of the lack of flexibility, not allowing for circumvention, and also the lack of commercial use as well. But I also liked the philosophical points you touched on as well, in relation to, for example, the Japanese kind of hybrid model as well. So it'll be interesting to see what happens going forward in relation to the the kind of consultation. But with that, I'd like to open the floor to any questions that anyone has. Does anyone have any questions or comments they'd like to put into the chat or ask Benjamin? Oh, I see we've got a question from Chris Morrison. Hi, Chris. Please just unmute yourself. Thank you.
Hi there, Greg, and hi, Ben. Thanks for that. That was great. Really interesting. I guess my question is coming back to the UK consultation. And when I looked at it, I saw that was very much focused on businesses, on commercial organisations. I mean, do you think that there were questions do you think that consultation could have been framed in a way that actually helped research institutions, universities? And were there kind of questions that they missed out with that real focus on sort of what the bottom line was for UK industry?
I think, I guess I sort of, I guess my overriding feeling, which probably isn't going to answer the question properly, is it felt such a structured consultation that it didn't even allow. I think I had sort of two issues. One was it felt so streamlined and so structured that, as you say, it didn't really open a door for discussion, wider discussion, you know, because we are trapped still. I think during Hargreaves, that there felt like there was an opening and a recognition within government that education, research, science was an important sector that needed to be considered when undertaking copyright reform. My personal view is they felt so battered from industry after the Hargreaves review that they've just, you know, what is it, shut all the shutters, is that the expression? You know, they've gone back to this sort of pre-Hargreaves position where the only thing that copyright affects are rights holders and consumers and, you know, if you're lucky, business. But we've sort of gone back to education, research, science somehow not being affected by research at the policy level, which is hugely frustrating and utterly ridiculous. Sorry for, yeah, I'll try and say it more direct next time.
No, I mean, that makes sense. I mean, the other thing I wondered is whether it's just too hard to get our heads around what AI is actually going to do, and whether they just wanted to stick to a very tight script, because trying to open it up has all these sort of crazy future scenarios of things that might happen over the next 10 years that no one can quite get their heads around.
Yes. I kind of felt with the licensing question, you know, when you're like, you are a trained project manager, you know, you have to sort of ask the questions of sort of, should we do something? And one of the options always has to be do nothing, doesn't it? And I'm sort of wondering if they were just using the kind of project manager playbook essentially and putting options. But, you know, I mean, honestly, do we have to discuss licensing 8 years later? It just seems extraordinary. Do we have anyone from the IPO registered? Looking at the net.
Don't think we do. We can always drop them a line.
Right, both. That was fantastic. Thanks again. Unless there's any further questions, I think we can go on to our next speaker. I'd just like to thank Benjamin once again for his fantastic presentation and time. And one thing I should have reiterated, sorry, as well earlier on, is if the speakers like after the presentation has concluded, please feel free to stay on basically if you'd like to as well. You're more than welcome. So once again, thank you very much, Benjamin. And I think we're now going to go into our next speaker, who is Dr. Emily Hudson. And I believe Emily will be discussing today controlled digital lending. And Emily is from King's College London, where she's a reader on law.
Hello, everyone. I'm in Australia. We had a really fierce electrical storm, which seems to have passed, which is good because I had these visions of the internet or my power being cut out partway through. So I'm going to talk today about controlled digital lending. And what I'm going to do is outline the arguments that CDL can be undertaken in the UK by reference to existing exceptions in the CDPA. And I'm going to focus particular attention the arguments that CDL can be undertaken by reference to sections 32 and 36A, as I believe the best arguments are currently under those provisions. On the slides, I've included references to cases and legal instruments. I'm not going to go into the weeds of every argument. And I think a key thing to bear in mind is that the best case does not mean a case so strong that libraries can confidently embark on CDL at scale. As we'll see, existing exceptions in the CDPA do not map onto CDL as easily as, for instance, the fair use exception of US law. Plus, I think that when it comes to judicial interpretations, US judges often read fair use with far more of an entrepreneurial spirit. And I think it's also the case that if there was CDL at any sort of scale, there would be pushback from publishers and authors. So part of what I want to do is sort of talk about risk assessment. And if you do want to have perhaps a bit of an experiment with CDL, what you might do to try and minimize exposure to risk. So let's just start with this slide, which is a definition of CDL. I'm assuming that people on the call are familiar with CDL at a sort of broad level. The key limbs, as I said, are on the slide. And I think one of the key messages is that these limbs, the own-to-loan ratio, the mirroring of lending terms between analog and digital material, the technological limits that restrict or prevent copying and redistribution by the borrower, all of these things are important to help demonstrate that the dealing is fair. So the first exception we're going to look at is section 32, fair dealing for the sole purpose of illustration for instruction. And here is the text of that provision with the colouring added to help us see the different limbs, the different components of this exception. And what I'm going to do is go through these limbs by reference to how contentious they are. So I'm going to argue that some elements are not contentious, so CDL clearly satisfies them, and other elements are contentious, in particular fairness, and we'll spend a bit more time with how the fairness arguments might run. So let's start with the straightforward stuff. And I've listed those on the slides. And might just say something first about the second bullet point applies to all rights of the copyright owner. This is significant because it means that section 32 has the potential to apply to all the stages of the CDL process, from the act of digitization through to then supplying the digital copy to the user. On the third bullet point, which is sufficient acknowledgement, just a reminder that this is not a full-blown academic citation. It's a requirement that is relatively easy to satisfy. It basically means that the title or a description of a work is included and the author, not the copyright owner, the author is identified. And I think for CDL, this will be readily made out in the scan itself, in the sort of metadata and so forth in the catalogue record. Finally, final bullet point, section 32 is not limited to educational establishments. So this provision relates to copying for the purpose of instruction. It's not limited to educational establishments. That said, I think it's going to be easier to make out a CDL argument in the context of an academic library, and I'll explain that and what I think is the position of public libraries as we go through. Now, next bit is somewhat straightforward, and this is the requirement that the dealing be for a non-commercial purpose. And I think there's a lot of discussion in the library community as to what commercial purpose means. And I think the better view is that CDL is not for a commercial purpose. Commerciality in the context of Section 32 refers to the specific act being undertaken. And while the profit-making or income status of the institution may be relevant, it's not determinative. So the fact, for instance, that a university or educational establishment charges fees is not fatal for making an argument under Section 32. Instead, you look at the act and ask whether that act is directly or indirectly commercial. So in the case of CDL, copies are not sold, they're not distributed for money, they're instead part of the usual process of lending by libraries, a process which, as we'll see when we have a look at Section 36A, is outside the public lending right and can be undertaken without remuneration to copyright owners. Next thing looks contentious, but probably isn't, and it's the requirement that the dealing is by a person giving or receiving instruction. Now, the reason why this looks contentious, but probably isn't, is because one literal reading of this limb of Section 32 is that the finger that presses start on the scanner or that clicks upload on the mouse needs to be attached to the body that is actually standing in front of students. That is, that giving or receiving instruction only applies to staff who teach when they're teaching and to students. I think this is wrong. I think it's wrong for a number of reasons. First, if we take a purposive reading of Section 32, it has to operate at the institutional level. The institution provides instruction through the activities of a broad range of people. So it's not just what happens in the classroom, it's all manner of acts before and after the actual classroom experience. It also would not make sense to limit Section 32 to teachers and students. Otherwise, we'd have the situation in which an institution, an establishment might be sued, and the teacher can rely on Section 32, but not the institution, and that just would not make sense. So I think this institutional operation of Section 32 is implicit. If I'm wrong on that, I've still got another argument in my arsenal, and that is even taking a more literal approach, the ordinary meaning of person in the context of statutes like the CDPA includes natural and artificial entities, i.e. corporate bodies. So if this is right, a library in an educational establishment can fall within Section 32 as the establishment is giving instruction. Now, what about a public library that has a bunch of students come in and those students say, we need these books, and the public library is asking, could it rely on Section 32 for CDL type practices? And I think this might be where Section 32 runs out, because for that argument to work, I'm just going to reverse back because I think we need the language of the statute. For that argument to work that the public library could rely on Section 32 to help students with their education, the language by a person giving or receiving instruction would need to be read to say by or on behalf of a person giving or receiving instruction. So there might be a qualitative difference between, for instance, an academic library that might outsource some of the digitization for CDL to a third party, and a public library trying to rely on Section 32 to itself do CDL for students. As I said, I think that the exception may run out at that point, which is why I think there's quite a different position at the moment for academic and public libraries in relation to CDL. Right, so let's now continue on with the journey to something else which is somewhat contentious, which is the requirement that the dealing is for the sole purpose of illustration for instruction. And the issue here is that there have been there has been guidance from the IPO, there have been other comments in scholarly commentary and so forth to suggest that this language should be construed narrowly. For instance, that section 32 applies only to uses solely to illustrate a point. And if we accept this approach to section 32, then a lot of educational activities will fall outside this provision, including CDL, because it would be rare that somebody needs to borrow an entire book to make a point or illustrate a point. But I'm not too sure that this IPO guidance was correct when it was written. And I think in any event, it may have been superseded by later interpretations, including interpretations coming out of the UK government, which suggests that section 32 is not about illustrating points, but about supporting, enriching and complementing teaching. I also think that this broader approach, this broader reading to illustration for instruction accords with the arguments I think are compelling as to how exceptions should be interpreted, in which, and drawing in particular from the Canadian Supreme Court, which I think is, if you're wanting to bolster your legal arguments, I'd suggest strongly looking to Canada as a fair dealing jurisdiction, which is very much forward leaning in relation to educational exceptions and fair dealing and so forth. And I think that the better approach, I think, to exceptions is or fair dealing exceptions is you say, we can give the purpose a broad interpretation. As the Supreme Court of Canada said in CCH and Law Society, research should be given a large and liberal interpretation. So that case was about a custom photocopying service by a law library. And it was held that the library participated in the research process. So we give the purpose a broad interpretation on the basis that a lot of the nuance and the intellectual heavy lifting is done when you analyse fairness. So if I was representing somebody in court and making these arguments before a judge, I'd also be looking to this sort of bigger sort of idea about how we should interpret exceptions, to argue that purposes should be given a broader understanding. So to apply this to CDL, this would mean that we accept that CDL is undertaken as part of the education process, at least where you've got students and staff borrowing books in relation to teaching and learning. This does present an issue, as indicated at the bottom of the screen, though, for staff who might want to borrow books for the purposes of research or research higher degree students. And this is where I think the arguments under section 36A might be helpful. Onwards, and let's talk about fairness, which I think is really contentious. And I think this is the place where I think those arguing in favour of CDL being within section 32 are going to have the toughest time. This is where the rubber hits the road. In UK law, fairness is not defined in the CDPA, so we have to look to the case law to get indications in relation to fairness factors. What we see in the case law is that fairness is a matter of impression. Judges have identified a number of relevant considerations, including the amount taken, the motives of the defendant, and whether the defendant's work was made for a purpose which rivals or substitutes for the claimant's work. So I'm going to pause on these fairness arguments for a while. In this first slide, what I've done is set out what I think are some of the key arguments that would be put against CDL being within section 32. And the two first ones I think are really strong. or the strongest arguments that can be put against Section 32. CDL involves the copying of entire works and the argument that it impacts adversely on sales of ebooks and other digital content. And I'm just going to park that second argument for a moment, that market harm argument, because it's got a whole slide or two coming up. So if you're doing CDL, what sort of arguments do you point to in favour of it being fair? And I've just outlined some sort of arguments that might be useful on the next few slides. One is the important public interest of education. And indeed, we see with various reforms to UK law and also in the DSM directive, this emphasis on wanting to support education, including remote and online education. You might also tie in the creation of digital copies to a broader access agenda as well. Another thing you might point to is the lack of an ulterior purpose. That is the only purpose of the educational institution in doing CDL is to support learning. You're not making money out of it. You're not distributing copies to the public. There is no other motivation. And in this regard, I have referred at points in the slides to the case against the Internet Archive. And one thing I haven't said yet, but should have, and I'll just make this point now, is that I think that with that litigation brought against the Internet Archive in relation to its emergency library, there's quite a lot of important factual differences between what the Internet Archive was doing and what, for instance, US libraries, academic libraries are doing with CDL. And it sounds very much like, in the US at least, there's a lot of activity amongst academic libraries, which is not nearly as contentious as what the Internet Archive was doing. So there's lots of ways in which we in the academic library sector can differentiate ourselves from the Internet Archive's activities. Continuing on with arguments in favour of fairness, the digital scan has limited accessibility. It's not being made available to the public at large, but members of the educational establishment or library. Furthermore, although in the aggregate, numerous students may have access to the same digitised material, the owned to loaned ratio means that the level of access cannot exceed what is possible for that physical book. Now, I know there are arguments that can be put against this. For instance, the lack of degradation, that physical books wear out after a while with overuse in a way that digital products do not. But I think that, again, if I was wanting to make the best case for CDL being within Section 32, I'd very much emphasise that owned to loaned ratio and what it means for levels of access. And indeed, the technological measures that are implemented on digital files also helps those fairness arguments because of the prevention of redistribution, the prevention or limiting of copying, and so forth. So that brings us to market harm. Now, it's worth noting that as a fair dealing factor, market harm is not about mere loss of income. It's about competition or substitution. So let's say you write a review of my book, you say it's terrible and nobody should waste their money buying it, and my sales collapse. That is not a relevant market harm for the purpose of fair dealing, for the purpose of criticism. Indeed, judges have told us that even harsh or unbalanced criticism can be made with the protection of fair dealing. Rather, market harm typically relates to instances where the defendant has a rival purpose, where their work substitutes for that of the claimant. Now, here the library with CDL is not making an entirely new product that competes on the market. Indeed, they have purchased a lawful copy of the work. for the publishers to establish market harm, they'll presumably need to argue that there is a relevant harm through the library using CDL rather than purchasing access to an ebook or some other digital platform. Now, how do we weigh up these these market harm arguments? Well, I've said this is not an area where economics clearly gives us a winner. What I mean by that is we are in essence dealing with weighing up different policy imperatives. The incentive effects of copyright, which might apply to publishers to help them invest in new works, versus measures to support the accessibility of existing works. These are incommensurable. You can't just put them on the scales. And the risk, I think, for those wanting to undertake CDL under Section 32 is a judge will say something to the effect, if I'm in doubt, I'll let the copyright owner decide, or this situation raises big policy concerns that are best left to Parliament. So just a few quick thoughts about some other arguments then that you might make in relation to market harm to sort of try and bolster those fairness arguments. And I think one thing that I would say is that publishers do need to be really careful in how they frame arguments about digital products, as this might raise questions about their adherence to principles from competition law. For instance, that one cannot use copyright to procure a secondary market, prohibitions on excessive pricing and tie-ins, and so forth. That is, if users have no ability to digitize entire print copies ever, they are entirely reliant on the pricing and availability decisions of publishers in order to access electronic works. And so far, what we are seeing with the whole ebooks debate is that publishers are setting prices for individual titles that are entirely unrealistic, and indeed prices to access platforms also can be prohibitively expensive. Now, I don't know enough about competition law to be able to say whether these practices actually rise to a level where there's a competition law problem. I can imagine that publishers would deny they're in a dominant position, for example. But I think it might be something that could be brought in the fairness arguments in terms of sort of weaving in some narrative in relation to what a finding that CDL is not and can never be within Section 32 would mean for the sort of market for books. Is there a reasonable alternative? This is where I think, if you're thinking about CDL, the arguments too on market harm may depend on what it is that you wish to digitize. And I think the far easier case, and the case which, if you are thinking of CDL, should be what you're starting with, is titles for which there's no ebook or digital version on the market. Because for those items, in the absence of CDL, students will just go without. And there may also, in many instances, be no resources that can be readily substituted. The trickier case is ebooks, is when ebooks or there's some digital platform which contains an electronic copy of the item that you wish to digitize for CDL. My sense from hearing speak people like Kyle Courtney is that US institutions are quite confident on that first scenario of there's no ebook, there's no digital version in terms of doing CDL, but perhaps are less likely or more reticent where there is a digital version available. And in fact, I think I've heard it suggested that CDL is not an answer to the ebook problem because it tends to be more retrospective in terms of the titles that are used. I'm not sure I'd be that pessimistic about the prospects for Section 32 and its ability to apply in those trickier cases. That said, I wouldn't start with a trickier case. I'd start with the easy case and make it work there before then considering whether you can expand the arguments. I'll try, Greg, to get this all done in the next 5 minutes so we have a little bit of time in case there's any questions. So some of these slides I didn't intend to dwell on, so I'll make sure we have time for a discussion if Chris Morrison happens to have a question, or other people for that matter. So tips to support fairness under Section 32. One is to very much adhere to all those limbs of CDL which make it more likely that the dealing is fair. As already mentioned, you may have much better arguments for market harm if you've got if the works that you're digitizing are orphaned, if they're out of print, if there's no digital version. I think to the extent you're relying only on Section 32, you might want to have staff and possibly research high degree students declare that they're only using the digital copy for the purposes of teaching or education and not research. And I've put here the physical copies need to be genuinely available for loan. I think that's just the idea that you sort of, that there is a sort of idea that once the digital copy is out, the physical copy is off the shelf, so to speak. And I just think that there should be some genuine lending collection and not just a pile of books in some storage facility that never gets opened that are then only being loaned digitally. Quick thought on Section 36A though. So this provision says that copyright in a work is not infringed by the lending of copies of the work by an educational establishment. And what I've asked myself in relation to this provision is what relevance might it have to CDL? And there's two main ways it might be relevant. One is that it just bolsters the case for CDL being permissible under some free exception because it reflects policy considerations that educational establishments ought to be able to lend without copyright restrictions. So it's more the sort of policy that it reflects. And you say that we can have that similar policy consideration in relation to Section 32 or some other exception. But I'm also interested in the idea that Section 36A could have its own work to do. And this would be useful because Section 36A is not limited to educational purposes. So that staff member who requires a book for research could then also be able to get that book under CDL terms. So it sort of expands the circumstances where you could use CDL. And in fact, my suggestion would be you are relying both on Section 32 and Section 36A. So how do you run the arguments? They're not as straightforward as Section 32. But I think you say, first of all, that lending clearly includes digital lending. We have authority from the Court of Justice to that effect and the other statements in statutes which make that clear that that's the case. One question is whether Section 36A covers digitisation for the purpose of lending. So does it just apply to that act of lending or prior acts? So there are arguments that one could make that by the lending includes all acts necessary for lending, but another option is this exception stacking approach. So it may well be that you digitise under another exception such as Section 32, but then that digital copy can then also be loaned under Section 36A. So you stack or pastiche together your exceptions. I've also thought about other exceptions and whether they apply, and I think that the case for Section 32 and 36A is much stronger. There are challenges in relation to all these exceptions, at least in their current form, applying to CDL. In fact, I think in some instances those challenges are insurmountable. Meaning that one thing that might be on the table is reform to exceptions. And I think the two things I'd push for, in relation to the existing exceptions would be reform, first of all, to dedicated terminals in section 40B, which I think shows real promise for online availability of content. And there's various levels of reform you could make, starting with just tweaking the exception so that it extends to the availability of content, not only on the premises, but within a controlled online network. So that could help the CDL. You could actually push it out to a general online availability exception. So there's various levels you could go to. And also just some suggestions for reform to section 32, just to sort of deal with limbs that might raise questions. For instance, does sole purpose for illustration need to be read narrowly? Why don't we just change it with the word education, and that would be much, much clearer. So what to do now, and this is pretty much it, everyone. So final slide. First point is the importance of how you frame your discussions. And I've sort of said this in other presentations I've given, which is that supporting access to learning materials is a mission critical activity. And I think one way to view CDL and other acts in terms of the legal analysis is to say it's a mission critical activity. How do we support access in a way which reduces our exposure to risk? If you ask the question differently, can we do it under copyright law, or what are the copyright problems? It's just this tweak in the framing that takes us from a set of questions that tend to prompt answers of no, it's too difficult and so forth. To say it's mission critical, how can we make it work? And in the case of CDL, bear in mind that we are applying exceptions in a way that I don't think is actually unique or exceptional. We already have an exception for lending by educational establishments, for instance. CDL just replicates that with digital files. So another way too of framing is to say this isn't as unique and as exceptional as it may first appear. Risk assessment may suggest a targeted and thoughtful approach to CDL. So this is recognising some of the limits in the arguments that I've gone through already, in terms of why it is that the fair dealing arguments aren't, for instance, as strong as the fair use arguments. And finally, I think it's worth thinking about, how do you make sure, like what would you say to authors or publishers indeed, to ease concerns about library activities riding roughshod over their rights? So actually, this is the last slide, the last substantive slide. The final truth is there's only so much copyright law can do to deal with problems with pricing in the academic book market. So as people have said over and over and over again, so I don't need to repeat it, part of the answer actually ultimately is going to be how we change our engagement with academic publishing, how we change models of textbook publishing, and so forth. So that's it for me. Thank you. Happy to take any questions if you have any.
Thank you very much, Emily. I'll keep my thank yous brief if you don't mind, because I'm conscious of we've got a comment or two in the chat, and I suspect we'll have a couple of questions been asked shortly. So just to say a massive thank you. I very much enjoyed examining the controlled digital lending, particularly from perspectives of section 32 and section 36A. As somebody who has struggled trying to examine section 32, I found it very illuminating, particularly around what is commercial purpose, and especially by a person giving or receiving. I've always found that kind of quite a woolly area in terms of trying to define, so that was very useful, and along with even examining fairness. And it was great to hear from a fair use perspective. You mentioned Kel Courtney, of course, but also it was great to see the tips at the end, how we can go about trying to implement this. So I thought it was really fascinating. So thank you very, very much again. And I mentioned there, I think we had a comment in the
We've also got a hand up.
Oh, we do. Well, we'll go to our hand up. Who has the hand up? Who do we
And
have?
also Simon Cox has said, well done for
Yes.
not mentioning the Ashes. I was just going to say, though, that it's a Barty party here in Australia, as Ash Barty has absolutely dominated her way into the women's final at the Australian Open, and watch out for her to comprehensively beat her opponent in the women's final on Saturday.
Sounds good. So sorry, we said we've got a hand up. Who had their hand up there?
Jane.
I think
Jane.
it's me,
Hi, Jane.
Greg.
Hi, Jane.
Hiya, hello everyone. Morning. Hi, Emily. Evening.
Hello.
Lovely to hear from you. My question is, practically speaking, in the UK, and you know, I appreciate you don't want to tell us what to do, but I mean, what do you think the answer is? That we need leadership? We need a couple of big, you know, well-funded institutions that could take the risk to try CDL and see what happens? Is that?
Yeah, I think that the arguments, look, I've developed the best case. Now, I guess one question is, amongst a community of people who are probably quite open to the idea that fair dealing can be applicable, how do the arguments land, right? Do they sound compelling to the audience most likely to find them compelling? Because if the answer is no, you think that this was too much reaching and intellectual gymnastics, then our answers are not going to be within the existing free exceptions. It's going to be law reform, changes to business models and so forth. But if we think that the best case sounds like it would be plausible, and it might be that we want to continue to work on it, then I imagine, yeah, that it's going to be somebody who's going to start doing it. But I think the other thing is they have to talk about it. Now, this was where, when there was last year, recall that that through your fair dealing webinars, we were able to talk a lot about using film in teaching. And my sense was that enough people started talking about doing it, and there was enough comfort. My sense is that a lot of people then were able to kind of feel like they're stepping into, like there's a wave going in front of them, they can step into it and be sort of carried along. So there is something for that approach, but it requires people to be somewhat open about doing it. Now, that doesn't mean statements on the front page of the institution website, but it might mean with things like, for instance, those fair dealing webinars, whether they're closed webinars where people can speak candidly about what they're doing, whether we can finesse the legal arguments and so forth. But I think that would be my sense. I think if the arguments are good enough and you start with the low-hanging fruit, the easy examples of the older works, they're out of print, there is no digital version, start there. Because the other thing too is to get all the tech right. Do you know, it's better to find it, and I think this is where others have far more knowledge than me. I just do the law, but in making sure the tech is right with all the sort of digitization aspect, with the TPMs you need to put on and so forth, to make sure everything works. So I think it's probably good to try that on the lower risk things than to start higher risk and then find actually there was a big problem and the university of such and such is now the sort of home of piracy. That would be my thought.
And that's what nobody wants to be, is it? Nobody wants to be the one to do it and get it wrong. But yeah, I think you're right. I think it's about developing confidence in the community, which is obviously is growing. You know, people started wanting to talk in a very closed way, but I think confidence is definitely growing. So yeah.
And what I'd add too is it may be thinking as well about like pooling resources in the event of challenge. Actually, I've got on the chat Kevin saying, would you be willing to act as legal defense ? Then with a smiley face. Well, Kevin, get rid of the smiley face. Of course, I'd love to do it. And I can imagine, I think getting my practicing certificate back to appear in court would be fantastic. But to actually be serious about sort of that question, and Jane, what you just said, it might be thinking about, okay, if somebody if there's a legal action against someone, what support can the rest of the community provide, bearing in mind that they are now carrying the can for what other people may want to do or be doing. So it's also, I think it's thinking about that kind of intra-community support. But as I said, I have a feeling that a lot of CDL is actually probably not too controversial when you think about how much it's been happening in the US. Who got sued? Internet Archive. They're doing crazy stuff. Right? They're not doing, what they're doing is at a level far beyond what I think academic libraries in the UK would be doing.
Thanks, Emily. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Right, so I'm just checking to see, Emma, if we've got any more comments in our chat box. I think we've got one more from Simon Cox.
And I think Simon may have had a question too about the alternative.
Yes,
I'm not too sure if I followed the question. I don't know if Simon was actually able to unmute and ask if you've got a minute to do this. What time are we due to finish? Is it now?
It's just in a couple of minutes, Emily, that's all.
Okay, let's.
I'm coming,
Simon.
hold on. I can't get the camera turned on, but you'll have to live without that. It was only in terms of practicality, in terms of, are we thinking back to the way we approach users, it's going to need to be a very specific unavailable item. And perhaps that gets into the justification phase to go down this route, because normally you listen to conversations here as a non-academic, and there's a lot of how do we provide the information differently, as opposed to the binary not having it or having it. Yeah, so I just wondered, it was just on a very, very practical level, do we already find solutions to avoid this, if anything? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll treat that as a comment.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's just the bravery in the sector type thing in terms of yeah, personally, I'd love to see us go to the mat on something, but it's going to be a tricky one, yeah.
Well, I'm happy. I can have a look if there was anything else in the thread and answer it in the thread. Greg, if you want to have your tea break. But thank you to everyone for listening. And I think I said previously, I'm going to write all up this analysis and put it on SSRN. And then I got hit with teaching. But it's going to happen because I'm now on sabbatical. So I will, if I think it would be maybe worth writing up this analysis and putting it onto SSRN so everyone can have a look at it.
Absolutely, that'd be fantastic. And just on that note, Emily, Chris Morris very kindly put on to his review of your fantastic book, Drafting Copyright Exceptions.
It's still available for purchase.
So please go for it. Absolutely, everyone. Fantastic book. So on that note, we'll reconvene. I'm going to pause the recording and we'll reconvene at 10:50. Now I'd like to pass on to our third presenter of the morning. We'll be meeting very shortly Bridget Vizina, who's Director of Policy, Open Culture and Glam at Creative Commons. And Bridget will be discussing this morning promoting access and reuse of cultural heritage, Creative Commons agenda for copyright reform.
Thank you so much for having me and for this nice introduction, Greg. So to repeat, my name is Bridget Vizina and I am the Director of Policy, Open Culture and Glam at Creative Commons. It was so nice to hear from Ben and from Emily just before me from far-flung places. I am a bit closer to you. I'm in the Netherlands, just across the North Sea. But as you know, Creative Commons is a fully distributed organization, and there are some of us in Europe, and most of my colleagues are in the US and Canada. So what I'll be doing today is actually take some altitude compared to the presentations that preceded me. Ben and Emily went into the details of specific regimes, specific exceptions, and I will be giving you a much broader overview of Creative Commons as an organization, our new Glam program, how the licenses work in respect to collections of cultural institutions, to finally cover the policy reform opportunities that we see and how copyright law as it exists cannot fully support the activities of cultural heritage institutions and why reform might be necessary. I'll also call on you to come and contribute, and I'll explain that a little bit later in the presentation. So let's get started. First, I'd like to give you an overview of Creative Commons. It's a nonprofit organization, as many of you probably already know. It's dedicated to promoting better sharing of culture and knowledge in the public interest. So it's mainly focused on ensuring that people can create and share the culture and the knowledge that they create or that they hold in a way that permits more social cohesion, that is really truly in the public interest. We're mostly known for our licenses and public domain tools, and that provides the infrastructure for open sharing to take place on the internet. So they were created 20 years ago. We're celebrating 20 years of the first licenses in 2022. And they've gone through many edits and versions over the year, but they remain the most used and the open standard for sharing cultural information and knowledge content on the internet. We are also a vast, extensive international network. There are lawyers, there are activists, there are experts in copyright law, in open education, in open culture, in open science, in open scholarship. And these are located all over the world. We have, I think, over 40 national chapters that promote openness in their respective countries. And in total, we have about 700 people making up our global network. Now zooming in to our Open Glam program. So I've been using the word Glam a lot, and I'll demystify that acronym for those of you who are not familiar with it. Glam actually stands for galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. And we've been using it as a shorthand to cover cultural heritage institutions as a whole, those that have collections of cultural heritage. We have a program since June of 2021, so just over 6 months now. We were able to launch it thanks to a generous grant from the Arcadia Fund. And this program is currently made up of 4 main components. The first is work on the legal and policy framework, and this is what I'll be going through towards the end of the presentation. And there, the objective is really to ensure that the legal and policy framework is conducive to the institutions carrying out their basic functions and fulfilling their mission. In other words, we're looking at mostly the copyright system and how it can be improved in order to meet the needs of institutions, the needs that are essential for them to carry out their mission. There's also a legal, technical, and social infrastructure component. And by infrastructure, we refer to our licenses and tools, which are legal tools, but also technical, because they can be machine readable and used on the internet. And they also provide a form of social infrastructure by bringing together people that share the ideals of openness and the enthusiasm for opening up content. On that matter, before I go to the next point, you may have seen in your mailing list or in your networks that we're currently conducting a survey of our public domain tools, CC0 and PDM, to which I'll come in a moment, to try to understand if they're fit for purpose for the Glam sector. And I'll share a link at the end of the presentation if you think that you have something to contribute. That would be great. Our third component is capacity building, and some of you may know about the Glam or even the CC certificate. It's a training program that we offer to librarians, educators, and now also Glam practitioners on the basics of copyright, the basics of open licensing, licensing from the creator's perspective, from the user's perspective, and also what are all the benefits and also challenges of Open Glam as a concept, but also how as it applies concretely. So I can also share more information about this. And then the last component is community engagement. We support our network, but also people forming our much broader community that are not necessarily formally a member of our network. We provide spaces for people to come together and share their challenges, their concerns, their ideas, and their activities, what they're up to, so that we can all learn from each other and build on that common language to make things better. So why better sharing of cultural heritage? Better sharing is the theme that runs through our new strategy that was launched at the end of last year of 2020. And we're moving away from the idea of more sharing, of open sharing, to the idea of better sharing. And what we mean by that is that we recognize the value of access, but also sharing of culture and knowledge, and how these are essential to sustain vibrant and thriving societies. So it's not about openness for its own sake. It's not about sharing for the sake of sharing. It's really because we think that there's a higher objective and a higher impact that sharing can help us achieve. And Glam, so these cultural institutions, are actually the gateways to access culture and knowledge. They are the pivotal points between heritage and the public. And of course, preserving, but also sharing and giving access to those collections is at the heart of their mission. There are many benefits to going open, and I won't go into the detail of how the many barriers stand in the way to going open, but I'll go through a review of what I think are the main benefits for an institution to go open from an external perspective and then from an internal point of view. So I think the most important one is because it helps institutions gain a more relevant place in today's digital society, because if it's not online, for many people, it's just as if it doesn't exist. So in order to establish an online presence, there needs to be some form of open access. Otherwise, people won't know that it's there, they won't be able to discover it, and they won't be able to use it. It's also a greater contribution to social cohesion and well-being, because Glams promote equity in access to knowledge and culture, and by making content more openly accessible and shareable, we increase equitable sharing of knowledge. It's also a catalyst for creativity and the creation of new knowledge, because it helps users create new meanings, new interpretations of the past in order to inform the future. By letting the knowledge, the content escape the walls of the institution, so to speak, institutions themselves can also gain some insights on what they hold, what they have in their collection, and these external perspectives can then benefit the way that they curate, the way that they care for their collections, and the way that they in turn provide interpretations about what they contain. Continuing on external benefits, it also allows a greater, broader, and more diverse outreach, because Glam collections obviously are no longer confined within a physical space, but can be shared on a global scale. All the way from a local scale with a local community to national, regional, and also international audience that grows as the content becomes more visible and accessible. And it's also a way to address global challenges, because by preserving the content and also by giving the keys to researchers and citizens to unlock the knowledge related to climate change, for example, or public health, like the COVID crisis that we're facing now, we enable people to build upon that knowledge and find solutions together on what concerns us most all around the world. It allows build unity in the scientific community by enabling access to a much greater range of people that might have ideas to contribute and solutions to develop. Now, from an internal perspective, there's also benefits for the institution itself. We have some some insights into how opening up is a chance for institutions to develop innovative and more sustainable business models that are based on open access. Of course, we know that many GLAMs are in dire financial situations and that they are struggling to generate revenue. Some studies have shown that this traditional licensing of images is not necessarily the most profitable, and that there are many other ways to actually generate revenue that does not build barriers around the content, but that lets the content remain openly and freely accessible while still having some form of revenue generation. It's also an opportunity for a more efficient organization model, because oftentimes staff will be so caught up in all the licensing requests that they cannot focus on other core tasks that maybe deserve more attention, like curation and outreach, that might be more central to the unique mission of the institution. So speaking of the mission, it's a way to become more mission aligned by making collections as openly accessible, shareable, and reusable as possible. That's really the greatest manifestation of GLAM's public value in the digital era. In other words, making their collections openly accessible online is the manifestation of their intrinsic mission, simply online rather than on site. There are many, many examples of cultural heritage institutions that have opened their collection, and I would refer you to the survey of GLAM Open Access Policy and Practice that's prepared by Douglas McCarthy and Andrew Wallace. A few days ago, they published an update. So there are some open collections in 49 countries. Over 1,300 institutions have opened up their collections either totally or partially. And that makes up mind-boggling number of over 68 million open access digital objects. I can provide the link afterwards in the chat, and you can take a look at all these institutions that have gone open. I see that there are some comments in the chat. Is it okay if I just take the questions at the end, Greg?
So yes, that's no problem at all, Bridget.
Okay, great. Then I'll go through, and then I'll take some questions at the end. So the legal framework around the Creative Commons licenses is important to establish. I think it won't be a revelation to anyone that works of art are protected by copyright. And that copyright is granted to creators of works automatically upon creation. So unlike trademarks in most jurisdictions, unlike patents, there is no need to register a work in order to have it protected. There's no formality. It is automatically protected from creation. And that creates a situation where by default, a work will always be published, made available, all rights reserved. That is the default. There is no way to automatically have a work that will have less restrictions than having all the restrictions, all the rights that the law grants to the creator reserved. So that's where Creative Commons licenses come into play. They are built atop the copyright framework. So they operate within the copyright system exclusively. They do not deal with any other types of rights or policy areas. And they allow creators or copyright holders, if these are different entities or people, to choose the rights that they want to reserve and those that they want to waive in order to share their work more permissively with the public. So it's a way to go from all rights reserved to some rights reserved. And we'll look into what those rights are, because the licenses are designed in a way that it's very clear to determine which rights can be retained and those that can be waived. So here you see a graphic with the many types of conditions that are associated with Creative Commons licenses along a spectrum from the most open to the most restrictive at the bottom. It's in French, but I think that we can all read these icons. So at the very bottom, you will have all rights reserved, which is in red and is the standard default copyright protection. And as you go up on the spectrum, you will see that less and less restrictions are attached to the works, which means that they are more open and freer to be used. And at the very top, we have the icon with the copyright sign, the copyright symbol, sorry, crossed out, which means that it's in the public domain and free of any kind of restriction. And the licenses, they define the level of openness that you as a copyright holder want to offer regarding your works. I'll start with the public domain tools because I think that they're the most relevant for cultural heritage collections, but I also go through the licenses as a refresher for those who might want one. So there are two public domain tools, the public domain dedication, known as CC0, and the public domain mark, or PDM. The public domain mark is used to communicate the public status, the public domain status of works. It's not a license per se. It doesn't have the same legal value as a license because it's not a license. It's not accompanied by a legal code. It's a label. It's a tag. It's information that someone can use on a work that is already in the public domain. So it's already free of any copyright restrictions worldwide. And the PDM serves to identify that work as being in the public domain and communicate to all users that it is in the public domain, therefore free to use without any restrictions. The public domain dedication tool, CC0, is can be considered as a form of license. According to jurisdictions, that might or might not be possible, but it is really a way to waive all the rights at once and dedicate the work directly into the public domain. No rights are reserved. The creators waive all their rights and place their work directly and immediately in the public domain. So it's as if it has been in the public domain, even though the official copyright term hasn't expired. In terms of the licenses, 4 elements can be combined to make 6 different licenses. So the 4 elements are attribution, known as by, non-commercial, NC, share alike, SA, and no derivatives, ND. So like I said, these 4 elements can be combined to make up 6 different licenses. The most permissive is CC BY, that requires only attribution, followed by CC BY SA, attribution share alike, CC BY NC, CC BY NC SA, CC BY ND, and CC BY ND, NC ND. Oh, I'm sorry, there's a bit of an animation here, extra. I'll move to the next slide to go into a bit more detail of what we mean by. It's attribution of the work to the creator. All the CC licensing, CC licenses contain this provision, and it offers the greatest possibility to use, reuse, modify, adapt the work, including for commercial uses. Non-commercial, in contrast, it can offer those possibilities, but for non-commercial purposes only. Share alike means that any derivative works that are created on the basis of a work that's licensed SA must be shared under the same or a compatible license. So for example, when you're combining a non-commercial license with the SA condition, all creators of derivative works have to apply the same or a compatible license. No derivatives mean that users may not share adaptations or derivative versions of their work. Now, the licenses are patched, they're not a fix, and copyright is often complex, unbalanced, outdated. It's a barrier to better sharing by GLAMs. It can undermine their public interest activities and prevent them from playing their role in the digital environment. And now, if we don't act to reform copyright, we risk exacerbating inequalities by curtailing efforts to provide universal access to knowledge and culture, and to carve a black hole into the world's digital cultural heritage. And now we are working towards a global copyright policy framework that is conducive to GLAM's mission. And there, I will list the 5 main elements. There has to be clear exceptions and limitations in the public interest. We have to protect and promote a robust and thriving public domain. There has to be a reasonable term of protection. And we also have to consider the interplay between copyright and traditional cultural expressions, indigenous cultural heritage and restitution, and also any interplay with the emerging field of artificial intelligence. So as concerns exceptions and limitations, also called user right, also called usage rights, in common law jurisdictions often encompass under a more general concept like fair use or relatively narrow or fair dealing. I won't go through this list, but we can see that there's quite a few exceptions that need to be into the law in order to enable GLAMs to conduct their activities, but also to make sure that their users can benefit from the collections and use them for all sorts of public interest purposes. The other element that I'd like to highlight is that we must protect the public domain from additional copyright layers. We've seen a lot of attempts by legislators, but also by institutions themselves to kind of add on another layer of copyright over items that are in the public domain. The EU recently adopted the Copyright Directive, and its Article 14 makes it very clear that digitized public domain works must remain in the public domain. In the UK, I know that the situation is not settled. I'd be happy to hear from you what the situation is right now, but just to say that if an object is in the public domain, the fact that an institution is digitizing it does not create a new layer of right. Therefore, there cannot be any licenses applied to a digitization of a public domain work because there are simply no rights to license out. So the law must make it very clear that there can be no copyright protection for digital reproductions of public domain works. Now, I talked about a reasonable term of protection. We've noticed that excessively long copyright terms can negatively impact GLAMs because they thwart their efforts to increase access to knowledge. There's been empirical work conducted around the world that has shown that culturally important books are less available in countries with longer terms than shorter ones. And so copyright should support a robust and universally accessible public domain for the encouragement of further creativity, cultural output, and not unduly delay the work's entry into the public domain. Now, concerning the traditional knowledge and indigenous cultural heritage interplay with the policy framework, GLAMs have a range of responsibilities and duties in respect of indigenous cultural heritage, particularly in light of questions around restitution, repatriation, and the sensitivities around heritage that is linked to living communities. So we've done a bit of research to see what might be a good policy approach to take care of these legal or ethical concerns outside of copyright. And now the last point is about artificial intelligence and GLAM. Ben has gone through this extensively. There are developments in artificial intelligence that present really exciting opportunities for GLAM, but they also raise copyright questions. For example, who and under which conditions can someone use the items, the content in GLAM collections for AI training? What might be the copyright or public domain status of AI generated content? And what might be some other barriers beyond copyright to opening up and sharing GLAM collections in light of the lack of clarity around AI? So I know I'm almost at time, so I just want to end with a call to action to please come and help shape copyright policy for GLAM, because everyone has to gain from a more modern and fairer copyright framework. We have a public consultation that ends on Monday on a draft paper, a draft policy paper that's entitled Towards Better Sharing of Cultural Heritage, an Agenda for Copyright Reform. So you're more than welcome to look at this document and share any comments and feedback that you think is relevant. And with that, I will invite you also to join the conversation. We have two platforms, the Copyright and the Glam platform. I'll share the links in the chat where you can come and participate in those conversations. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to questions. Thank you.
Many thanks, Bridget. That was fantastic. I loved hearing about the societal and cultural impact of Glam as well, in relation to the kind of helping to establish the sharing online, creating that presence online as well, and having the benefit to society as well. But also like the breakdown of how Creative Commons licenses could be used to help support the, the kind of licensing structure in terms of what the flexibility they offer to users as well. And it was great to hear about the kind of Glam's missions as well. And I like the overlap again with artificial intelligence, as you touched on. Ben discussed it as well, but in particular the use of Glam collections for AI training. So I thought it was interesting. AI is coming up again in our discussions today. One thing I like to pick up on, and I think you mentioned it in relation to public domain, it was the additional copyright, at least from a UK perspective. Unfortunately, I don't have too much knowledge around that, but I was wondering if one of our attendees or other speakers might be able to kind of comment on that or help provide some insights. So it was just to open that up to the floor, as it were. And Bridget, thank you once again. That was fantastic.
Greg, hi,
Yes,
it's Chris
hi.
here. I wondered
Hi,
whether
Chris.
I might come in and to say thank you to Bridget. An excellent presentation as ever. Apologise as well for some of the chat about Willy Fogg, which was me and Simon getting slightly sidetracked by childhood memories. And I know that tweet was shared by Doug McCarthy, who you've referenced his work. And the question that I had was around what the EU single market, digital single market directive had done with its with Article 14, works of visual art in the public domain, and the EU's attempts to stop cultural heritage institutions from claiming copyright in public domain content that clearly in the UK we haven't put in place because we're not part of the EU and the UK government has no plans to implement that directive. But two things I was wondering if you could just update us on. One, what is, in your view, the state of play across the EU in terms of the jurisdictions? Are they making the progress that you would hope them to make? And then the other question is, those of us that are in the UK working in institutions that are digitizing and providing digitized content, but we don't have that the provisions in our local law, and we have what I would say is fairly inconclusive case law, Bridgman v. Carell, where there's still this confusion, we still see this practice. So are you able to give us some thoughts on both of those points?
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris. I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's probably too early to tell about any national transposition of the directive in several EU countries. Many of them, as you know, have not completed the transposition and were not yet able to see. I would say that Article 14 was probably not that controversial compared to other articles like 17 and 15 that really gain much more attention from policymakers. So I'm not sure that there has been that much discussion about the application at the national level of Article 14. What I do know is that many countries like France, or I think Ireland, claim that there were no modifications needed to their copyright law because anyways, non-original works were not protected. So if a reproduction is not considered original, it's not protected by copyright. So there is no need to have a specific provision for reproductions of public domain works. I think that has been the approach in some jurisdictions. I think that there's a need for more efforts at the international level to really clarify that, because even though the law might be clear, and that's only in maybe the EU and the US, other parts of the world have much murkier interpretations of that concept, and the application on the ground remains problematic. So even though the law might say that there is no protection for faithful reproduction, some institutions might still claim those rights in the false belief that they do own rights, and therefore restrict access to digital reproductions, even though there are no rights to invoke there. So I think that we will continue to make efforts at Creative Commons to clarify that there cannot be any copyright protections for faithful reproductions of works, and that we will try to guide institutions in understanding what other paths there might be to sharing their collection that does not restrict access to those reproductions. And yeah, in terms of the UK, sorry, I know about this case. I also know about some other sources that kind of left the question open. So if anyone in the audience knows more than me, I'd love to hear more about it.
Thanks, Bridget. I just wanted to come and say that's really interesting to hear. I think from my perspective, as much as you might try to focus on advocacy and changing the legislation and the legislative position, the most effective route to this is advocacy discussions within those communities, within the cultural heritage institutions, rather than telling them they have to do it because the law says so and this is the way it must work, despite the fact that they want to do something entirely different. It's about saying, well, actually, how do you, as you said in your presentation, follow the mission of your institution? How can you make this work? How can you remain relevant? So I think that's work for us all to be engaged in, and I'm really excited about the possibility of how we might make that happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think Emily also wrote a very fascinating paper on this, on how best practices might actually be a faster path towards clarity on this issue rather than lengthy policy reform.
That's super. Thanks, Bridget and Chris. And I noticed we've got a comment in the chat from Jane Secker, and it's just I suspect misunderstandings about copyright are the reason many small GLAMs don't openly license their collections. I wonder what we can do to help them more. So that was just a comment from Jane in the chat box.
Yeah, there's many things that we can do, and having those kinds of conversations as we are having now, I think, is one of them. But that is one of the main goals of the Glam platform, is really to bring Glam practitioners together to find ways to make the message much more accessible and compelling to institutions that, you know, let's be honest, they have lots of other concerns. They are struggling financially, as I mentioned, and they don't often have copyright expertise on hand, either internally or even access to some copyright expert outside of the institution. So I think we're still at the raising awareness stage that, you know, we need to dispel also the myths around copyright that are really raising barriers. Sorry, that didn't come out right. We need to make sure that copyright doesn't continue to raise barriers by educating, and the efforts that Chris and Jane are doing around copyright literacy, I think, are one great example of how to dispel the myths around copyright and increase knowledge among institutions about what is copyright, what are the risks of infringement, and how to take a mindful approach to sharing their collections that is lawful, but at the same time permits as much great access as possible.
I absolutely agree. Yeah, I think the copyright literacy work that Chris and Jane are doing is a prime example of that. I would agree it's important to kind of educate people in the best practices, what they can do, and I think also examine opportunities that, for example, Creative Commons licenses, produce, as well as in the copyright exceptions, as we discussed during Emily's presentation. I think these are all great things that we can do as a community to obviously widen the knowledge base that we have. So I think that's fantastic going forwards. And once again, Bridget, I'd like to thank you for your time, actually, because I think that's now 11:30. So thank you once again so much for your valuable time. No, thank you. That was fantastic. And I think we're now ready to go on to our final presentation today, which is Chris Banks, who is Director of Library Services and Assistant Provost at Imperial College London, and Chris will be discussing rights retention and the development of institutional open access policies. So Chris, I will stop sharing my screen and I will wait for you to be ready in just a wee moment or two. So there we go. That should be me now. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Can I just check that you can see my screen and
Yes.
also that, and you're seeing the full screen presentation?
We are. Thank you very much, Chris. Thanks again. Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
You.
So, rights retention and the development of institutional open access policies. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. This has been, what I've heard so far has been absolutely fascinating. And you are now going to get a presentation from somebody who has very, very limited legal and copyright expertise. So I bow at your expertise. And you're not going to get any statutory instruments or anything like that, I'm afraid, in this presentation. I'm going to be setting a broader picture today. But I'm delighted that that broader picture is being set in Scotland. Hello, all my friends in Scotland. And I will start. So many of you will be aware that the work that I'm talking about today started off and is probably still most widely known as the UK SCURL. This was work that we started back in, I think, 2015, 2016, looking at how we could support our researchers in their choice of publication whilst making their works eligible for the REF and making them enabling them to meet their funder requirements. So I put the website there just for those who wish to refresh where we started with all of this. We are on a journey at the moment. We're on a journey that starts where publishing was funded through reading fees. But what that led to is that the reading is the privilege of those with funds to enable them to read. And we are moving towards a destination where publication is funded through some kind of publication fee, whether that's paid directly by the author or by other mechanisms. What we will be funding is publication, not reading. But without due care, access to publishing services or publication services may not be equal. So one of our risks is that we're moving from an unequal reading environment to an unequal publishing environment. But nonetheless, we are some way along that route, and on the way, it's pretty complicated. Open access is one of those wicked problems. It has multifaceted actors. We have the funder, the institution, the researcher, and the publisher. And on this journey, and in the UK in particular, we have had a blizzard of policies. They started in 2005 with the Wellcome Trust policy, and most recently, the new UKRI policy was announced in August 2021. And on the way, we have had many policies and many steps have been taken on this road towards more openness to publicly funded research. Now in 2013, which was some of the prompts for us starting our work, we realized that things were enormously complicated. For the researcher, they've had their idea, they've applied for their research grant, that's been peer reviewed, they've hired their staff, they've done their research, they've crunched their data, they've written their findings up. Those findings are then peer reviewed, and then with the aid of working out whether their work was compliant with their funder and eligible for the REF, there was this enormously complicated decision tree. I think it's about 25 steps, and thanks as ever to Arthur Smith at Cambridge for mapping that out. So that was the complexity that we were seeking to reduce for our authors at that time. When we look at the flow of contracts, we begin to realize why things remain quite complicated, because typically funding agreements are between the funder and the institution. the individual researcher has an employment contract with the institution. The institution is the one that takes out the subscription package, or more recently, the read and publish agreement with the funder. But it is the researcher who is signing whatever publishing agreement is required by the publisher. And in signing that agreement, we have to remember that we're in a world now where for many, many people, all the time, they are accepting terms and conditions that they never read. In order to access the services, the information, and such like, they are simply clicking accept. And as such, we are signing away data, we are signing away property, but that is the world that we live in now, and it is no different when a researcher is signing an agreement with the publisher. Then when you look at those actor perspectives, the funders are seeking immediate open access to research outputs in a cost-effective way, and they are seeking that because it is taxpayer funding that is funding the research. The institution is concerned about costs. No research is fully funded. It is an absolute reality that our international student fees and our any commercial activities underpin funding of research. So the institution, in terms of the costs of research and the costs of research communication, are seeking to keep those costs as low as possible. Researchers are seeking individual progression, and publication plays a huge role in that. Cost rarely does, if ever. And publishers are seeking to cover costs, and for those commercial publishers, seeking to maximize those margins. So in terms of retaining rights or not retaining rights, for the researcher, the retention of rights has typically not been a concern. Getting published is the priority. And for the publisher, acquiring rights is something that they seek to do, because the more rights that they can acquire, the more rights that they can exploit and market and sell and generate margins. So why do we need to take action? Funders and researchers are increasingly seeking to make funded research open access immediately on publication, and funders are embedding these requirements in contract covering awards. Some commercial publishers operate through the monopolistic acquisition of brand, and in this I mean journal titles, and copyright, and to monetize these. Some publishers require authors to sign contracts that cause a breach of the funder contract signed by the institution. And our original rationale was the policy stack. Our current rationale might better be described as the transition stack. So our original UKSCL purpose remains. This was to devise an institutional open access policy which retained rights to support authors in their choice of publication venue. So that purpose remains even in this new transition stack, to retain that author choice of publication venue and to constrain costs. So what's needed in order to exit from this policy-induced complexity? First off, we are seeing greater funder policy alignment, because much of the original complexity was with funder policies. And Coalition S and Plan S has seen this gradual alignment of funder policies, with UKRI being the latest aligned policy. And for the UK, it's one of the biggest funders. For libraries, we are moving from negotiating reading access to negotiating for reading and publishing services. And we're making considerable progress. And I think this is really important here, because I think there was a sense amongst the funders that what we were seeking was an end game that was a green or an author accepted manuscript world, and seeking to undermine the subscription process. Whereas all along, certainly from my perspective, what we were seeking to do was to constrain the costs of the open access to the version of record and to retain author choices of venue publication. So we're making considerable progress in that, because we've moved from 9% of content covered by transformative read and publish agreements in 2019 to probably around 55% last year, and with the imminent Elsevier agreement to greater than 75% of JISC negotiated deals will be covered by read and publish agreements. And for the Elsevier deal, there is no publication cap. So the deal that we are poised to sign with Elsevier gives unlimited publishing in Elsevier hybrid journals, including the Cell Press and Lancet titles. So we've made good progress on policy alignment. We've got promising progress on transitioning read and publish opportunities for our researchers. We are increasing the awareness of rights retention as a mechanism to support funder policies, but we do have ongoing resistance by publishers. So when we were originally exploring rights retention, we explored these options. We explored that the status quo, which is that the academic is allowed to retain copyright and the freedom to sign that copyright over to publishers. We explored the SPARC model, whereby the academic retains copyright and then licenses back the right to publish the author-accepted manuscript. We explored the Harvard model, which is that the institution has a policy requirement to assign certain rights in the author-accepted manuscript. And we explored the possibility that the institution can claim copyright on all research outputs. And in those original discussions with authors, it was that penultimate choice that researchers preferred us to progress and to explore within the UK. Now, funders have added an additional approach, which is that the academic asserts rights in the author-accepted manuscript arising for the submission. So they don't seek to license back, which is the SPARC model. They assert the rights at the point of submission. So they give prior notice of that assertion. When we did our original exploration, one of the things that we needed to do was to establish the legality of what was the Harvard model, so that non-exclusive right to the institution in the UK. We needed to establish the legality of that. And I'll come on to that in a moment. But in terms of what next, and I'm saying, is it a bird or is it a plane? And hopefully that will become clear why I'm asking this question. So the UK SCL, or the rights, the institutional open access policy, whereby certain rights were to the institution, we know that that approach was legal in UK copyright law through the mechanism of prior notice, whereby the non-exclusive retention of rights is not nulled by the subsequent assignment of copyright because of the prior notice. Now, when we were originally doing this work, we were kind of working behind closed doors and haven't started our publisher discussions. I think one of the things that the last few years has shone a light on is that the publishers are now very, very aware of rights retention approaches available to institutions and to individuals. But nonetheless, that formal prior notice is an element of this, either through the assertion by the individual or through the prior notice issued by the institution or collection of institutions to publishers. But what has emerged over recent months is which law applies, because some publishers are knowingly drawing up agreements which, when signed by the author, will cause their institution to be in breach of the agreement with their research funder. So my question at this stage is, are these agreements under copyright or contract law? And if under contract law, what happens when a publisher agreement is constructed so that it knowingly causes a breach of an existing contract, namely the funder agreement, the funder contract with the institution? So that's the question that's sort of hanging in the air at the moment. Now, when we explored the UK SCL, so the Harvard approach, we took a risk-based approach. What were the risks of something happening? And I think that's where we also need to turn to now. What are the risks and how likely are they, and can we mitigate them? So one of the risks that we are seeing potentially at the moment is of publishers of refusing to accept research outputs where prior rights retention have been asserted, either by the author or by their institution. Now, there's a risk to the publisher here, because over time, should they take this route, they effectively refuse quality research outputs, because a lot of the funding a lot of the work that they are publishing has been assessed as quality and has been funded by very large government research funds. And there's also the risk that over time, those research outputs find a new open access venue that is not restricted and does not cause that breach of contract and enables the research to be published open access. So there is, as well as any perceived risks to the institution or to the academic, there are risks to the publishers in taking this approach. And then the one that also hangs in the air is the risk of a publisher suing an individual researcher. Again, there's the potential for significant reputational risk to the publisher in taking this approach, because we know that at the moment we are in the absence of case law to support the approach that we've got, but in addition to potentially there being a risk to an individual author amongst the tens of thousands of authors that are taking this approach, there is a reputational risk to the publisher, that a publisher is suing an author for doing something that enabled the author's institution to be in compliance with their funder agreement. But there's an opportunity here, because we've potentially got the opportunity to clarify the legal position through case law. We know that another approach that we can take is that our publisher agreements can be tightened. We've demonstrated and we've demonstrably reduced and restrained costs through the Elsevier negotiations. And for future agreements, we can make rights retention an additional requirement. And so this is actively in consideration at the moment. The other way in which we can restrain costs is that we can ensure that a condition that funder money is able to flow to the publisher, and particularly for hybrid journals which sit outside transformative agreements, we can make what is effectively UKRI Route 2 an essential requirement in order for funds to flow under UKRI Route 1. So UKRI Route 1 is a fully open access version of record, and UKRI Route 2 is the author accepted manuscript deposited in a repository and immediately made available under a Creative Commons attributions license. So there is work that we can do there. Now, Edinburgh, and this is why I'm delighted to be speaking here today, Edinburgh has done the heavy lifting. Edinburgh has a new research, publications and copyright policy, and I'm sure you are all very, very aware of that indeed. And the rest of the UK is indebted to the work that Edinburgh has done in bringing this policy to bear within their institution. So I think now what we're talking about is not so much the Harvard model, but we're now talking in the UK about the Edinburgh model. I like the language of the Edinburgh model. I like the simplicity of the Edinburgh model. And we are poised to take that leadership forward within the UK, looking at our institutional policies. And we are poised to do so with the renewed interest of our academics. But the challenge we have is that our new focus needs to be on researchers. It needs to be, others have talked today about that kind of process of educating researchers as to what they are signing away, particularly when it comes to copyright agreements, because there is only so much protection that we can give. We also need to do a lot of awareness raising. So our new focus is on researchers and institutions while we continue on our journey with publishers. So I haven't answered a lot of questions here, but hopefully I've framed the next steps for you. And thank you very much again for inviting me along, and let's talk.
That was wonderful. Thanks, Chris. Oh, there we go.
And hopefully I've stopped sharing.
Yep, we're fine. Thanks. That's us. That was fantastic. Thanks. In this instance, I very much got to bow down to your fantastic expertise, as open access is an area that's very unfamiliar to me. So I actually found it fascinating hearing about how the funders approach. For example, you have the various models of the Harvard model, for example, Spark as well. So for me, this was all great to hear about these kind of various models and how the law applies as well. There's some publishers not only drawing up which agreements, etc. So for me, it's been a very fascinating journey. And then it was also good to highlight the Edinburgh model, or the research, publications and copyright policy they've drawn up as well. So it was fascinating to hear all about those kind of resources that are available to us. But I would now like to kind of open up to the floor and see if anyone has any questions for Chris. And thank you once again. That was fantastic. Thank you. Let's check the chat box as well. Let's check for raised hands.
Hi, Greg. It's Chris
hi,
Morris.
Chris. Yep,
It's
yep,
Chris Morrison here again. Try not to hog, and thank you very much, Chris. That was excellent as ever. I was reflecting on the event that Queen Mary held earlier this week as well, where we had Professor Asun Estefe from Barcelona University talking about her research. And I know she spoke to you as well as part of that. Ultimately, her conclusion was that when we're looking at this open access kind of stuck point, that copyright law is not the problem. Really, fundamentally, it's one about where we need to negotiate and we need to come up with solutions, and that's how we move to where we're going. My reflection on that is that copyright is absolutely fundamentally part of this process. It's one of the things that we have to navigate, and it's part where we are in this transition. And I agree, what Edinburgh have done is absolutely fantastic. But in terms of actually working through those things, trying to get consensus across the whole of the sector and trying to make that second route, the Harvard, or now as you're calling it, Edinburgh model, something that we can all adopt. Do we actually need some more coordination? Do we actually need more resource, more oomph being put into building those consensus positions and working out those complex legal arguments that we discuss at length? But sometimes it feels a bit like we're going around in circles, and then what UKRI have presented with us, it hasn't resolved those issues. We're now back into the swirling thing of, at what point do you tell who? How do you know that you're protected? It looks like we're going back to the Spark addendum thing if it means that researchers keep having to intervene and put special wording in there. From your position, do you think there is a way forward where as a sector we can come together and actually make this a reality?
Yes, I do. I think I'll be bold here, and I'm going to say I think 2022 is the year of the Edinburgh model. I think Edinburgh's heavy lifting and leadership is incredibly important here, because I think those who were involved in the UK SCL negotiations before, there was institutions are incredibly cautious, and through the politics of fear, some publishers are effectively accenting that, or rather they are further causing that caution. I think with some of the things that we are now seeing, I'm seeing a bolder institutional willingness now. When I first went to Imperial, I was always asked, what are Cambridge and Oxford doing? Before I was, and you know, everything was all, what are Cambridge and Oxford doing? What are Cambridge and Oxford doing? I know that many other institutions are asking, what are the Russell Group doing? I'm now in a situation where actually I've got a bunch of academics saying, why can't we do this tomorrow? So I'm having felt like I was pushing a rock up a hill. I'm now seeing a huge, great ball rolling down the hill the other side, and I'm now needing to run and catch up with it. And I'm getting a lot of interest from other institutions to moving on this. I think the other thing it's fair to say is that UKRI have gone as far as they can in that kind of rights retention piece. Now it is for the institutions to do something. We have a role to play in this as well. We can't simply swing between what the funders say and what the publishers say. We have a role in bridging that gap and taking this forward. And as I say, with Edinburgh having done that already. And I mean, the other thing that particularly buoys me is the UCU stance that came out earlier this week on the e-textbook issue, and the fact that UCU is now focusing in on effectively the exploitation of that monopolistic ownership of content and the challenges that it places for education, you know, the unreasonable costs in delivering education. So the fact that UCU is also stepped out there, I think gives us hope that the work that Edinburgh did with UCU and the unions in Scotland can more widely translate across the UK. Because what we're seeking to do is to support the academics in this. This is not a rights grab for institutions. This is to support the academics to communicate their research at a cost that is affordable to institutions.
Thank you. And I think that I think we do need a lot of support. We need to be supporting each other. Another aspect of this that I've seen in raising these issues at my own institution is that there is a real push to maximize revenue generation for a sector where many institutions are finding that to have a sustainable financial model, they want to be exploiting intellectual property that's created. So when you start changing and looking at your intellectual property policy, then are you putting something in there that could impact on your ability to exploit rights and work with commercial partners? Now, I think those things can be dealt with. I think they're kind of separate issues, but where they come together, I think there's a lot of nervousness about fiddling with something that might mean somebody ends off walking off with all of the family silver.
Yeah, I mean, we were fortunate in Imperial that we think that only a couple of lines of our policy needed to be changed, but some other IP policies may need more of a root and branch approach to that. So yes, looking at IP policies locally, because the pieces of the jigsaw here are the institutional IP policy, the mechanism by which contract of employment and policy is embedded in that. You know, does the contract of employment refer to external institutional policies that might from time to time be reviewed, or are they embedded within the employment contract? So yes, all of those things will have to be looked at institutions.
And one final thing for me, just a reflection, when we were discussing this as part of our working group, when we start talking about the whole of the open access, all those different models, all those different routes, it's incredibly complex. Even those of us in our community, in the scholarly communications community, sometimes find ourselves getting a bit lost in that mix. And you know, the academics that we have representing and talking about their experiences, they're saying we don't really understand what you're talking about in some ways, and it's not surprising because of where we've got to. So I think we do need that push and that support. So it would be great if, you know, this creates momentum, but I think we need to have dedicated resource in this area somehow.
Yes.
No, I was just wanting to sort of follow up on Chrissy's point there, because the original rights to retention, as it was originally sort of pushed forwards, was the authors wouldn't really need to do anything other than put this certain wording in, and then everything would be okay, even if the contracts said something different. So the authors didn't really need to do anything other than put this particular wording in, and that's all they needed to do. And that's all we really needed to communicate to them. And then obviously this all seems to have changed, and you know, now they are sort of told not to sign anything that's going against that rights to retention language. And that means that we're now relying on individual academics to really follow these policies and to really read those terms and conditions. And that's something you kind of said yourself, Chris, during the presentation, that people just, you know, tick agree all the time on a regular basis in their lives. And so I think there's a real communication piece that we need from the sector for academics. And I feel that's a little bit missing at the moment as sort of a on a wider and grander level. And us as individual institutions will have to develop those materials and content. And I wondered if there was something, or if you know if there's something on a wider scale that's being created to help with that communication.
So I think there are two things that you're alluding to here, because the placing of the statement, of course, has come out of the Plan S, the Plan S work. And UKRI only requires the statement to be placed if a researcher is or might take route 2. And one of the things that we are trying to say to publishers is that if there was that simple linear progression whereby something's submitted to a journal and the author knows which route it's likely to end up, but if something gets rejected from a journal, it might end up somewhere where open access is not of the version of record is not a possibility, and therefore that's where the language might be required, even if it might not have originally been required when submitting to the first journal, the preferred journal. This is where the institutional approach, I think, comes in. So this is where the institutional rights retention approach, whereby it is a policy of the institution that rights. That researcher writes or grants the institution certain rights, because at that point the institution can do the heavy lifting in terms of the notification of the publishers, and we can do that in a way that says to the publishers, this is not because what we want in the long term is for all of our research to end up in our repository in the version of the author accepted manuscript, but it's to cover those instances where there is not a route to a publishing venue which enables the author, either for economic reasons or simply because of journal policy reasons, which enables the author to sign an agreement that doesn't conflict with their institutional agreement. So when you say, is there something happening, this is where I see the taking forward this year of the institutional approach to this. Is where we're headed. So yes, that's what I'm hoping will happen. But it does need enough institutions to engage with this in order for it to be something that we can widely roll out and widely communicate.
That's lovely, thanks, Chris. I'm just checking once again the participants just to make sure there's no hands raised. And I don't see any hands raised, so I think that's us now for this Q&A session. So if I may, I'll just go into closing remarks now. Thank you, everyone. And just bear with me a moment or two, please. And there we go. So we have no further questions. So I'm just going to go into a closing statement. So to begin with, many thanks to all our speakers especially those who came from other time zones for taking time to deliver an excellent range of presentations that covered a wide range of pertinent topics. And I think this illustrates what a diverse range of expertise we got to enjoy this morning. We had Ben, who delivered a fascinating presentation around the text and data mining exception and examined the current UK exception, how it sits in relation to the rest of the world post-Brexit. And we enjoyed exploring AI from a technical and philosophical point of view as well. This was followed on by Emily, who examined controlled digital lending, and also from the context of how sections 32 and 36A could possibly use to defend using materials under the controlled digital lending. And then we had Bridget, who gave us a fascinating insight into the galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, Glam, policies and framework, along with how the Creative Commons licenses could be used to underpinning the sharing of materials. And finally, we had Chris Banks, excuse me, who of course covered rights retention and development of institutional open access policies, and we got to examine it from the actors' perspectives, from funders, institutions, researchers and publishers, and examine the various models as well, and of course highlighted the fantastic work that Edinburgh University have done in relation to their policy. And before we go into a quick promotion that some of you might have quickly glanced at earlier, I'd like to quickly thank my fellow SCURL committee members, Deborah Ferns, Eugene Stoika and Seth Thompson for helping put together an excellent programme, and Jill and Dale for fantastic work in the promotion of the event. And once again, thank you to our speakers, and also I really enjoyed the reflection during the Q&A sessions as well. So thank you once again to everyone who participated, and thank you to everyone for coming along today. And just quickly, I do have, if you bear with me, I'd like to do a quick promotion of an upcoming week-long event and how SCURL was involved in this. And we also have Chris Morrison and Jane Secker with us as well, who are involved in this, and Deborah Ferns as well. But the event is called Fair Dealing Week, as you can see, and this event is the first UK Fair Dealing Week, which commences on Monday the 21st of February and concludes on Friday the 25th. This is a week-long celebration of the UK's legal framework and is being coordinated by the Alt, Copyright and Online Learning Special Interest Group, that's CoolSig, and that is co-chaired by Chris Morrison and Jane Secker. And this follows on from last year's Fair Use and Fair Dealing Week, which ran across America, Canada and other jurisdictions from the 22nd of February to the 26th, and it was led by and devised by Kyle Courtney from Harvard University. And the purpose of the UK Fair Dealing Week is to not only celebrate and raise awareness of this important legal framework, but it's to do so through discussion and events and success stories as well, and really to examine the opportunities this framework presents. And we already have a launch event on Monday the 21st, and other events are lined up. One of them being the SCURL's Copyright and Legal Matters Group Fair Dealing Coffee Morning, and this will be on Thursday the 24th from 10 AM to 11 AM, and this will be exploring the challenge of using copyright exceptions for global online teaching and we're very lucky to have Debbie McDonald from the British Council, who will be delivering a 20 to 25 minute presentation, and then we'll be discussing questions and case studies relating to fair dealing submitted by the attendees in advance of the session. And please note, for all the events that are happening during this week, everyone is welcome, whether you're in cultural heritage, whether you're an academic or learn technologist. It really is open to everyone, and there should be links posted now within the chat that provide more information about the event, where to book, and where to just get a general idea of what the event is about. So there should be in the chat box now links for that. And if nobody else has any closing remarks, I'll stop sharing shortly and then I will stop the recording. So thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for your time. Hope you enjoyed it, and goodbye for now, and look forward to see you later on this year. Thanks again. I'm now stopping the recording.